Welcome to Affordable Foundations, Legacy Impact Through Housing, the podcast that explores how housing shapes communities and creates lasting legacies. I'm your host, Cecilia Cossio, and each week we'll dive deep into solutions, challenges, and opportunities in affordable, attainable, and workforce housing. From current housing models to innovative approaches reshaping the industry, we'll explore the policies, investment strategies, and community-driven initiatives that are making a real impact. Housing isn't just about buildings, it's about people, opportunity, and the future we're creating together. We believe everyone plays an important role in affordable housing, whether you're a real estate investor, developer, policymaker, property manager, or someone passionate about creating positive change. Affordable Foundations is your go-to source for insights and inspiration. So let's break barriers, redefine possibilities, and build a legacy together. Hi, welcome to Affordable Foundations Legacy Impact Through Housing. I'm your host, Cecilia Cossio. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Alan Ferguson, Sr., Chief Housing Officer for DeKalb County, Georgia. With a remarkable career spanning from real estate finance, community development, and economic development, Dr. Ferguson has spent years working at the intersection of policy and practice, finding ways to align private investment goals with the long-term needs of affordable housing and community revitalization. In our conversation today, we're going to dive into some of the biggest questions shaping the future of housing. How do we define affordability in today's economy? What shifts are happening in the way policymakers, developers, and communities view affordability? And how can local governments lead the way in redefining solutions that don't just meet today's needs, but build stronger, more resilient communities for tomorrow? Dr. Ferguson, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. Glad to be here.
Yes, well, I want to start with a really simple question. I say it's simple, right? But it's what drew you into housing as a lifelong focus?
Sure. So, what really drew me into housing was, I saw at a very young age just how impactful housing, could be, and it's because of my experience with my family. My family, we were a working class type of household, and my parents really went through, great efforts to not only make sure that we had a safe, quality, place to live, but also that we remained within the same school district. And it took a significant amount of effort throughout, the 4 or 5 years that we matriculated through high school, in order to keep us there. And so that really made a strong impression upon me personally. And that's what really kind of drew me into this space of focusing on community and economic development. And once I, graduated from college and I began my professional career, I, learned about this world really by happenstance of affordable housing, and that was it. Everything, clicked for me. I found, what I was passionate about, and allowed me to really, to make a career of it, doing what I loved most, really impacting the lives of people through housing. And so that's why I'm here.
Well, that's phenomenal. And, I think a lot of us that are in this space, there's a personal why, there's a personal reason. And I have been in the affordable housing space from the property management side,
Yeah.
and and from the personal side. So like I remember being evicted once as a child. Like that made a big impact, and I lived with my grandparents. But I will tell you that I can still visualize the officer out there while we were moving stuff out. And my grandpa was a hard worker. It
Yeah.
wasn't for lack of desire to pay, it was just inability to pay. And so anything we can do as a community, listeners, as public servants, private investors, I really feel like every one of us has a responsibility. So again, thank you for being here today. So in this, tell me, how do we define affordable housing in today's economy?
Sure. And that's a great and timely question. So, I still think that the standard, which, applies, from HUD in terms of really spending around 30% of your income or hopefully less on your total housing costs, so your cost of housing, but, supported, utilities, if you're a homeowner, taxes, so on and so forth, is really the standard that needs to be met. Now, for a variety of different reasons, for cost reasons, for lifestyle reasons, people, may be forced or may choose to spend more than 30% of their household income. But I really think 30% is that measure, is that standard that we're all trying to achieve. And really almost all, programs that you see really emphasize, right sizing the amount that, folks pay, that families pay, for housing costs right around 30% of income.
Yeah, that is, I'm going to write this down because I'm going to go back to that in just a bit. When we talk about housing and we talk about people, um, you know, owning homes,
Yeah.
I think there's so much in between there, and there's a lot of segue that goes into different directions. 30% of what, right? If you are on the HUD program, it's could be 30% of maybe $100.
Right.
And I think homeowners, 30% of their income at the time they buy their home. But what happens when there's changes, or if their income doesn't increase, or there's a decrease? There's so many different things that we can segue into. And I know that, like, sometimes I take too long on these calls because I'm like,
No.
but it's all important. It's all foundational. It's all the basis of people having a home, whether it's an apartment or whether it's a home that they own. Because a lot of times our homeowners get into these homes and don't realize all the additional expenses that come with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, really home buyer education is key. And there's a lot of home buyer education that's oriented around, how do you qualify? How do you get into the home? But I really encourage people to not only seek out programs around how to get qualified and how to get into the home, but also take advantage of those informational educational programs on what happens after you become a homeowner. And, I can think of several, nonprofits, neighborhood works organizations. Habitat for Humanity, is a great organization that actually put on classes that really emphasize to prospective home buyers, well, here's what happens after you own the home, and teaches them those skills such as, how to, flush your own hot water heater. Do you even know that your hot water heater needs flushing once a year? Now, how to make those minor repairs, because really anything that the homeowner can do themselves without having, to hire, repairman or handyman or somebody, to come in, really is money that they save and really maintains the long-term affordability of the home. And then also, I think one of the things that we just don't talk enough about is really educating folks on the number of property tax abatements and relief that they could potentially qualify for. And so that when they buy a home for, those states that allow it, filling out that additional form so they can get their, homestead property tax exemption. Seniors, many states, many municipalities have programs in place, for seniors where they can get additional property tax deductions. If you're disabled head of household, there are some property tax deductions, available. So really kind of taking advantage of all of that also helps preserve, the long-term affordability of being a homeowner and being in place, and provide some insulation, if you will, against rising property taxes, which you'll face over time as your home appreciates and increases in value.
And you don't know what you don't know, right? So
Exactly.
let's talk about financial literacy and how it impacts us.
Yeah.
Because I think at the most the children that are involved in any of these HUD programs in these multifamily properties, I always said, any of our supportive services, let's teach our kids about financial literacy, but really at the core, like, what does compound interest mean for $5?
for a child, like, and how can they earn that? Get them thinking outside of what they see each and every day, because we know that in many of these communities where there is a 30% AMI, 40% AMI, 50% AMI, 60% AMI, we're not even talking about home ownership at that
Yeah.
point. We're talking about survival of the fittest, right? And that
Right.
is part of what we're trying to solve. Just make sure that our children have different experiences that they can get themselves out there too, or we can provide these different experiences. The schools, while they are great, they don't really teach financial literacy at that level. And I'm going to tell you, myself as a homeowner, there was many years that I paid a lot of taxes that I didn't need to pay. And
Yeah.
or the other part was the insurance. Our insurance costs continue to go up. And, many people don't know how to go get insurance quotes, or when their insurance is coming up, or what is the cost of, replacement costs versus there's so much there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I 100% agree with you. I think financial literacy needs to be, standard, in our schools. If we're teaching math, there's no reason you can't teach financial literacy, right in line parallel
Yeah.
to that. And it really, really becomes increasingly important, like you said, especially for, a lot of working families and being able to have that knowledge, but also to impart that knowledge and experience to their children so
Hmm.
they'll grow up with those same kind of financial healthy habits that you impart upon them when you're telling them, hey, eat your vegetables. They're vitamins and
Right.
vegetables and things of that nature. So with that having been said, yeah, I can't emphasize enough good, access to financial literacy. There are a number of programs that offer free financial literacy, and you can even find it available readily local in your communities. A lot of nonprofit groups and churches, synagogues, houses of worship
Right.
also foster those financial literacy types of programs. And it all leads to kind of more stable, more secure households, and really that launch pad for economic mobility,
Yeah.
that I think everybody wants to see the next generation achieve.
Yeah. We want our legacy to build for tomorrow. It's okay,
Exactly.
today's great, but what does tomorrow look like? I
Yeah.
think that is like so key. Earlier you mentioned affordability. I think you said there was some stuff folded into what does affordable mean, right? My question on this is, should affordability also include access to transportation, healthcare, and education? And not just cost of rent or mortgage, right? But these other things that make an impact.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So several years ago, and I don't know if the website is still up, but HUD did this study. HUD Department of Housing and Urban
Hmm.
Development did a study around locational affordability, and that was taking a look at not only housing costs but also transportation costs. Because if you are located in areas and geographies where your housing costs may be low, but you have transportation barriers or limited access to transportation, so those costs are high, the savings cancels out,
Right.
against the increased cost of the transportation. And so I think definitely as you talk to, not only homeowners but renters as well around what is affordable. You can't ignore things such as transportation costs. You can't ignore, obviously, the housing costs, but you also bring up a key point, which, makes a tremendous amount of difference, which is access to quality services and
Hmm.
amenities. And so, being in a place where you can get, easy and ready access to jobs, being in a place where you can have access, to fresh foods and not living, in a food desert, having that access to quality food, improves the overall health, of, your household. And then, access to, to healthcare, recreation, all of those things really matter, for a family trying to create a very, very strong quality of life and create even more opportunity, especially, for, the children, and their household. And so
Yeah.
taking all of those into, to context is really, really important. for whether you're a homeowner or a renter.
Right. I was a single mother, and I remember we didn't have public transportation in the town that I lived in. So it was like a twofold, right? You're looking at what schools your children are going to go to and public transportation. And when people would out to vote, they would vote against public transportation. I was blessed enough to be able to have a vehicle and have family around if I ever needed something. But, not everybody is so lucky or has
Sure.
that opportunity. So they have the challenge of location and, like you said, having to go to the store, the little store across the street, and pay double, triple the price because
Yeah.
there's no grocery stores in their areas.
Hmm.
I think that's definitely a challenge and hopefully something we continue to see improve.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you a lot of the work that we talk about here, in DeKalb County is around building holistic, comprehensive communities. So we're not just thinking solely about, "Hey, we've got this parcel of land, let's try to figure out how many units that we can get there." We're thinking about, what's a balanced quality of life, for this particular area. So we make note of, what this area has a lack of quality retail. Let's make sure in our planning we include some opportunities, to create a quality retail. This is a food desert. And what's our game plan around bringing, a supermarket, to this area? And then, all of the other things as well. Where's the nearest transportation node? Where's the
Mhm.
nearest access for recreation and green space? All of those things really kind of go into planning well-designed, self-sustaining communities.
Yes. Yes. Well, my next question for you would be, what are the biggest shifts you've seen in how policymakers, developers, and communities are thinking about housing affordability amid the current
Yeah, so that thanks for asking that question. So, I've been fortunate enough to have been around in this business to actually see the conversation change and, the people involved, the stakeholders involved in the conversation change over time. And so very early on in my career, when we would have discussion regarding housing affordability, it was focused on traditional quote unquote affordable housing,
Mhm.
housing that was publicly subsidized, supported, by HUD or your local, housing authority, and really targeting, extremely low to very low incomes. Now, over, I would say, within the last 15 years, that conversation has evolved to we're no longer discussing an affordable housing crisis. We're talking about a housing crisis in general, where households and individuals and families with, very strong, solid, secure incomes all of a sudden are finding themselves further and further away from attaining that American dream of owning a home, per se, or living in, the community of their choice because there's a lack of housing options available to them in those communities. So
Right.
we're really at a very interesting time, I think here in the United States where we've got multiple stakeholders at the table, including stakeholders that weren't at the table before, now engaged in this conversation saying, what can we do about housing? What can we do to create more housing opportunity? What can we do to create housing faster and at better quality that's more sustainable, that's more environmentally friendly than we did in the past. And that has really opened up a broad number of opportunities to engage in a different group of stakeholders in a major and significant way. And that's where I see the housing conversation going forward in the future. It's less about traditional affordable housing and it's more about what is workforce and what is attainable housing and how can we make sure that we're creating housing opportunities really for everyone and
Yeah.
not just a targeted segment of the population.
They went from it's going from stigma to essential.
Exactly.
Right. So
Exactly.
like and how do we help that? Because while there is your traditional programs out there, we want to see those people on traditional programs step into the 60%, into the 80%, into the 120%. Like that is the goal. And I will tell you, from someone who was on Section 8 as a teen mom, I was 18. I just had my daughter. My ex took off to the military. I think he was making $500 a month. And
Yeah.
like, I, until we could join him, we had no way. Like we were on, it's pretty sad, right? That somebody who's in military has to do this, but this is where we were at, and we weren't, we didn't receive a housing allowance because that's not where he was at that point. And so I say all this to say, like, it used to be a stigma, and now it's an essential piece of what needs to happen. But there's so much planning that goes from, a 30% voucher to the 80. How as a community can we be part of that growth? Because you want to see the stepping stones. You want them seeing going from a voucher or a, living on a project-based Section 8 property to moving into that, home, to moving into that next position, next stepping stone, or at least give that experience to the children where they are taking those steps to move to those levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think we're moving into a place and a space where you're going to see more cooperation and more collaborative efforts between, different organizations or different services than what you've seen previously. And so, taking, the example, how do you move someone along the income ladder or the prosperity ladder, as I would describe it? You've got to make sure that they're aware and really encourage and incentivize them to take advantage of other services that often just operate in a different lane. And so I'm talking about workforce development services where individuals have an opportunity, to improve their skills, to upskill themselves, to get that initial training so that they can get that better paying wage earning type of job to help move them up on the economic ladder. And also, I think that also ties into the educational system because the public schools, they're better served when those households are stable. So I think what you're going to find is more partnership between the educational system, the workforce development space, and the housing space, really kind of combining efforts to support what I generally described as, economic mobility initiatives.
Yeah.
Trying to create those opportunities for people to upskill and gain better incomes. Because one of the, the key tenets, the original premise, if you will, of public housing or publicly subsidized housing was that this wasn't supposed to be a permanent situation. It was supposed to be a temporary lift, and then they would essentially graduate, if you will, out of public housing. Well, for far too many, that graduation hasn't happened. And so I definitely think that in this environment and going forward, you're going to see a renewed emphasis on making sure that that graduation happens because that does two things. Number one, you increase the economic mobility and vitality and you get a household financially self-sufficient. And then when you do that, you also open up that publicly subsidized space for the next family, the next household that needs it. And that really addresses some of the supply concerns that are in traditional affordable housing as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that it all works together. If we could just broaden that space up, education, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest challenges I had when I was in the property management space, fortunately, I work for an owner who absolutely put supportive services out there for the residents. But I think the biggest challenges is watching a mother go to work and then her rent changing and then her daycare changing. And then, so like, it was like, well, what do I do here? Because if I go to work, now my kids are alone. There's nobody to feed them when they get home. And like, there's all these things to break. She's trying to break some of the cycles, but it makes our system is not really set up to assist in that. And so like, I think, I say that story because I think that was one that just always got under my skin because I was like, how do we stop this nonsense? Because you have somebody who's trying to go to work, somebody who's trying to make a difference, somebody who's trying to put their kid in daycare, but then it becomes unaffordable to live it there because their rent goes up based on their income. And I know it all goes hand in hand, right?
Right.
But it's like, geez, we got to do better about this. So, dealing with the different nonprofits and different supportive services out there, because there are a lot of supportive services out there you could take advantage of and help improve the family situation. And again, it's all about knowing the resources, I think.
Exactly. It's all about knowing the resources. And, I think that, everyone who's engaged in this space, I think it behooves them to really understand and to do the homework to understand, what is the platform of resources and services that are out there,
Hmm.
to, affect the residents, affect the tenants, that we're trying to help and support. And the fortunate thing is that, for most affordable housing developers, they understand and they get that.
Hmm.
And that's actually, part of the requirements. You know this well. Part of the requirements for them to access certain types of programs and certain types of financing resources, they have to provide those things. But for those property owners and for those investors who are not engaged in those programs, we've got to, really, really figure out a way to kind of bring them into the fold to let them know, hey, these resources are available. And
Right.
if you can encourage and incentivize your residents to take advantage of these resources, you're going to end up with a much stronger, much more certain and stable, tenant base. And all of a sudden, you're going to attract tenants not because you're offering a lower rent, but because you're offering a greater opportunity for improvement. And that's where you want to be, quite frankly, as a proprietor, as an owner of a property, you want to attract tenants and because they are getting a quality living experience with you and being able to introduce them to those types of services that can support their quality of life and their forward socioeconomic mobility, I think is a huge selling point to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's the developers. I encourage them to focus on long term and understand, not just focus on it, but truly understand long term community impact because you can't make it just about returns. The returns will come if you're truly passionate about that focus of community impact. Because people want to take care of their homes. People want to live in a place that they are happy, like, the pride in their home. They want to see their kids stay in the same school. All of that is really important. And so I think it's thank you for sharing all that. That's all part of a bigger picture that we don't always zone in on, but community impact should be your main goal.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it definitely should be your main goal for sure.
Yeah. Well, and then my other question for you is in the context of what they're calling the housing crisis, and that is what we have. It's just,
Mm.
affordable housing is hard to come by. How should we really redefine affordability to reflect the realities of today's housing market?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. The market that we traditionally used to target for home ownership, for example, which is that 80% of median income, up to 120
Hmm.
percent of median income. That group of workers that we used to target for home ownership because of a variety of different factors, those home prices, those home values have now gone out of reach from
Hmm.
the traditional models. And so what you find is that unless you have just a robust array of down payment assistance programs and things of that nature that you can layer together, home ownership is out of reach for those groups. So I think one of the things that we need to fundamentally re-examine is the different tools that we're able to provide to prospective home buyers and making sure that we're right sizing those tools, to
Hmm.
the current environment. I also think, taking a step back and a bigger, broader view, we need to really examine how housing policy is done in the country, which it's very localized. Zoning is very much a local issue. And, I completely get that, people want to control what happens in their own communities. But I think from a federal policy level, you've already seen some conversation around really incentivizing local markets, local governments to make changes in their zoning policies and processes that facilitates the creation of home. Because one of the reasons why housing is so expensive is there's just flat out not enough of it. So what can we do to, ease the regulatory burden to allow, housing creation to occur much faster on a much faster timetable so that we can make those homes available now versus 2, 3 years down the road as it typically takes. But going back to, this notion of affordability, I also think that, we're operating under a different context, especially when you look at this younger workforce that's entering the market. A lot of them, quite frankly, are burdened by student loan debt.
Hmm.
Those student loan debt burdens, they come into their qualification, ratios in terms of how
Right.
much house, they can afford. I think there needs to be a re-examination of that as well in terms of the mortgage qualifying process and kind of, right sizing to the times that would allow for more opportunity for, those positioned to be, quite frankly, higher wage earners in the economy to also access those home ownership opportunities earlier in their careers as well. As you well know, owning your home, has been and continues to be, one of the fundamental pillars of how people, build, their personal wealth, how they
Right.
have a personal asset, that they can tap into for other opportunities in their
Yep.
life, whether it's writing that tuition check to send that, child or that grandchild, on to, college education, or whether they tap into that home equity, to start their own business or to make another investment, that can, add to their economic well-being, that figuring out ways to allow, those potentially higher wage earners to access home ownership earlier, in their lifetimes and their careers, I think is going to be key for us to examine going forward as an industry, as well as from a policy aspect.
Yeah. Absolutely. Home ownership is the key to creating your own family's
Yeah,
wealth. And that's why it's so important that we start with financial literacy when these kids are young and, or,
yeah,
the young mothers that are starting out, because it's so easy to be overburdened with all kinds of different debt
yeah,
and not being able to buy that home, which then puts you back a number of years if you don't know what you don't know,
yeah,
right? Like that's
exactly.
it's kind of the thing. So, and let's talk about that home ownership piece a little bit before I jump into the next topic.
Mm,
I know that many times when especially our seniors, when they have these homes, they become very worn and they're not able to keep up. What does your city do, or what do you guys do, or what do you recommend that local governments do that might work to help with some of those things? Because I think this is a hard thing here, but
yeah,
a senior lives on an income and they don't have the funds.
yeah, exactly. So one of the things that, we have here in the local market, is a number of, call it owner occupied rehab or preservation, type of programs. And many of those programs are focused on, providing, the critical repairs, keeping homes, warm, safe, and dry per se. So you're not talking about, the type of home makeovers that you would see,
Right.
on some of the network television stations. But really, you're talking about addressing those fundamental issues to make sure that the house is in good condition so that people can, remain in the homes. But another feature that many of those programs offer is to provide those aging in place modifications as well, such as, changing, the bathroom so that
Hmm.
instead of a tub that you now have to, that you step over, you're now having a zero entry shower that can accommodate a person aging in the home, especially if they begin to have mobility issues, and adding, the ramps and the grab bars and things of that nature to actually make the home more safe and secure for someone, aging in place. Those types of programs, especially when you have communities where you have a lot of older home stock, you tend to find a lot of older legacy residents, and they're really tremendously impactful to allowing opportunities for those seniors to age and remain in place in their own communities. So that's one aspect of what we do. But another aspect of what we do is actually encourage, the creation and development of new seniors focused housing. And, there's being, a growing demographic in the country and definitely within our region, there's a lot of activity around creating new seniors housing. And that does really twofold. You're getting seniors into quality environments, that they can enjoy, they can afford, that are amenity rich and are programmed with social activities, that are appropriate, for that population.
Right.
But when they leave their existing home and they move into seniors housing, they're opening up their previous home to the next family.
Hmm.
And so making sure that you have that balance of programs, as I mentioned, the down payment assistance programs, the special mortgages that you can get that allow for repairs and renovations to be done on the home, at the time of purchase. Having those programs in place is equally important because you want to make sure that those neighborhoods, their communities that the seniors are moving from remain strong, viable, and vibrant. And there's
Right.
no better way to do that than to populate those homes with another growing family.
Absolutely. 100%. It's bringing in a family into that new home that is affordable
Yeah.
to the situation, right? So, as a private investor, and as a partner and a multifamily owner myself, I understand, and because I was in affordable housing,
Yeah.
I understand look, I understand the good, the bad, the ugly, the pretty, I get it. I've seen it all and I get it. But not everybody has been exposed to that, and they've got these things in their mind. So my question to you would be, what strategies have you found most effective in aligning the private investment goals with the long-term need of affordable housing and community revitalization?
Yeah. Well, throughout my career, I've been very fortunate, to be able to apply, a variety of different strategies. And one of the things about the private market is that, especially when it comes to just housing in general, there's the local opportunity that exists, on the ground, whether there's demand for new product or, the preservation of product, that's one thing. But then the essential piece is really the capital,
Right.
and the capital is mobile. And by that I mean when you're an investor and you have a choice of investing in this city or this state or this neighborhood versus another that offers, the similar type of opportunity but greater return, your capital mind says, well, I need to be here. We're over here with a greater return.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a strategy to, increase private investment and attract that private investment, I really encourage local municipalities, to really have comprehensive strategies around, bringing together all of the array of resources, that they can muster to support, in this case, housing development,
Right.
and really offering the private market, a single or as close to a single avenue of accessing those tools and those resources as possible, because you want to lower the barriers to people private investors accessing your tools and your resources to create the product that you need. And if you have an environment where you as an investor, you have to go searching around for every piece, every resource, that's exhausting. But if I can make it easy for you and I can say,
100.
Cecilia, you can come see me and I can talk to you and I can work with you across this broad plate of different resources to help you figure out what's the right combination that can work for us, in terms of creating the affordable housing for you as the developer and investor, and then for your capital that you're attracting to your project, the better. So I
Right.
encourage really municipalities to think about ways that they can make it more efficient, providing kind of that single point of contact to make it more accessible to investors, coming into your market. I think in the places that I've been that have employed those types of strategies, they've been tremendously successful in getting investors to the table
Yeah.
to invest in their markets.
It's keeping that open dialogue, right?
Yeah.
So like the more barriers you put in the way, the more people are going to turn the other way.
Exactly.
So, it goes hand in hand. Well, what role can mission-driven capital like CDFIs or philanthropy play in complementing traditional financing? Like, how do you see those two or three or combinations working together? Because it's kind of along the lines of what we were talking about, just finding
Yeah.
that capital.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, all three, can work together because, typically what you'll find, with CDFIs, and, mission driven, social impact organizations, that they tend to invest for longer periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
And the cost of their capital is less. And on the front end of when you're doing an investment, when you're doing a deal, having the right mix of capital and at the cost that works for your project, not just to get it built, but to operate it in a sustainable way over the long term is key. It's essential. And so CDFIs and mission oriented focus, social impact funds and equity investors play a key role in working with traditional capital markets in order to kind of create this blended capital stack, if you will, that helps make projects work. And where you find the public agency side, the municipal side, is that we can enable and create tools that not only provides that opportunity, to create the housing, but also support its long-term sustainability, such as if you're providing, a certain amount of affordability in your project, at a certain depth of affordability, you can work with the local municipalities to, get access to, property tax abatements and other tools and resources, that assist with the cash flow and the operation of the property. And so, I like to think of it as, and people will know me, have heard me use this term, a dozen times, if not more, but I refer to it as making lasagna. And
I love it.
in some cases, you can make lasagna and it's very simple, three ingredients, your noodles, your sauce, your cheese. And in other instances, it becomes more complicated. You're doing with multiple layers and everything. But at the end of the day, you end up with a lasagna that everybody loves and everybody can eat and it all blends together. And so that's what I would really, really encourage, parties, to do, to circle up, get around the table and figure out how to make deals work versus figuring out, how to say no to certain
Right.
things. There's
That's smart.
there's always a way that you can get to yes. And it's a negotiation. It's give and take.
Yeah.
And so, I find the best deals are done that way.
You can't approach you do approach a city and then you have conversations. And then when their immediate response is, well, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do this. And you're like, okay, well, so what are we
Yeah.
going to do?
Exactly. And I think that's the key question. Well, what can you do? What can you do? What are you going to do? And I really, really encourage folks to when they're approaching, municipalities and public agencies, if you've got a model or a way of doing things that you've done before in a different place at a different time that's worked, some people don't realize that everybody doesn't have the same toolbox. Everybody doesn't have the
Right.
same bank of experience. And so that's something that you can bring to the table and saying, hey, look, this worked in XYZ city. Why can't it work here? Because you will find that there's pent up demand for people wanting to be creative and innovative, in the work that they do. And so if you give them, a new and better mousetrap, they're going to use it. They're
Yep.
going to use it.
It's always great to be able
Yeah.
to use. I look for all kinds of ways to be able to improve whatever it is that I'm doing. And, I just see that moving forward with all the new things coming our way. Looking ahead, if we get this right, what does a housing landscape look like 10 years?
If we get it right, in 10 years, I would say we're going to see, smoother, more efficient housing, production processes. You're going to see more and more alignment of policies and programs, to make it, simpler and more efficient and to lower those barriers, for folks who want to create housing, in their markets. And you're actually going to start seeing, some stability, if you will, in certain markets, both on the rental side as well as the home ownership side, because more housing will be getting built. You have an increase in supply. That's going to provide some moderation for tenants as well as homeowners and make that housing more attainable. And with the advances that are being made in, technology and building design and methodology, I think you're going to actually end up with better and better housing products. So if we bring it all together and we get it all right, you'll start to see the fruits, of that, definitely within the next 10 years and beyond.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of mindset shifts of your traditional housing models to, the affordable housing models that families can still use. It's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm one of those that is still working through that, and I'm in the innovative space. Like I want to try something new all the time to see what works and what works better than the last product. But yeah, it's still that mindset shift, So.
Yeah, exactly. It's still that mindset shift. But the thing about that is it varies market by market.
Mhm.
And so, I really encourage folks to, to do that research, to do that homework, like good investors do. And if you think you've got an idea, it may not work where you're sitting right now, but it may work in that market, next door, and to lean forward and to try it.
Lean in, lean in.
Exactly.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, certainly. I would definitely say that, housing is an issue that if you have housing, you may take for granted. But think about, beyond, kind of yourself and your own personal situation, and think about what types of communities you want to be in, that you want your children, your grandchildren, to be able to enjoy. And think about, what type of choices and decisions that you're making, today, especially, as you go out and vote and you participate in your, civic activities and things of that nature. What are you doing to, to really ensure and create, housing opportunities for tomorrow? Um, and so, I encourage them, to get engaged, to stay informed, to follow housing policy, not just at the federal level, but at the local level, and be vocal in what your concerns are, and making sure that everyone at least has access to the types of housing that they can afford in a great quality way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your insight today. We truly appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh,
I've
no,
enjoyed
yes.
this. I
We're
really enjoyed
grateful
this.
to have you here. Like your insight is remarkable. I think that people, they listen to this. It's, again, it goes to affordable housing. They're just thinking about one lane, but there's so many lanes in
It's so many
this.
lanes.
Yeah.
So many lanes.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining. Remember that affordable housing isn't just about buildings. It's about people, purpose, and progress, and building a legacy for future generations. So you guys go be in your greatness each and every day. And thank you for joining us today.
That's a wrap on this episode of Affordable Foundations, Legacy Impact Through Housing. I hope today's conversation sparked new ideas and gave you a fresh perspective on the role we all play in creating sustainable, thriving communities. Affordable housing isn't just about buildings. It's about people, opportunity, and the legacies we leave behind. Every step we take to improve access, challenge stigmas, and drive solutions brings us closer to a future where everyone has a place to call home. Make sure to subscribe to Affordable Foundations on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with others who are just as passionate about making a difference. Follow us on social media for more insights, updates, and stories from the field. And before we go, a special shout out to the incredible teams working on the front lines of our multifamily properties. The property managers, maintenance teams, leasing staff, and all those who make housing possible every day. Your work is the foundation of stronger communities, and we see you. We appreciate you, and we thank you. Until next time, let's keep building a legacy that lasts.